Hey there, this is Jason Hendrickson, talking today in this video chat about media and violence in today's culture. We'll discuss things like cognitive development and adolescence. We'll talk about social interaction and the use of social media and some of the problems that are arising from that, cyberbullying and some mental health issues. We'll talk a little bit about violence in media today in both movies and in video games. And then we'll talk a little bit about the prevalence of revenge and even how it's involved in school shootings. What's interesting is that media use is at levels today that have never been seen before in previous generations, especially among adolescents. 2015 study of over 2,000 students between the ages of 13 to 17 showed that 92% of them go online daily. 25% admit to constant use of online resources, and over 75% of those teenagers own smartphones. Now, that was 3 years ago. There's no reason to think that those numbers have not gone up since then. Teenagers and adolescents and their use of online, particularly social media sources, have created their own subculture, which includes an own unique language and style of communicating. And due to this social media culture that's been created, these adolescents are looking to peers actually more as models and role models than ever before. And these relationships that are developed are more intricate, they're more far-reaching, and they're deeper. That's because they're able to speak longer to more people all over the world and on much more sensitive topics because, well, honestly, there's no parental supervision in most of these cases. Access to their friends is instant and can be anywhere at any time with little to no supervision. Again, this reinforces that unique culture that's created. With adolescence, brain development studies have started as far back as 1905, and it shows that adolescents' brains develop in regions linked to emotional reaction before they ever learn to process those emotions. Basically, that means that adolescents will react emotionally to stimulus before they've learned how to process and actually filter those emotions properly. In other words, it's true, studies have proven that teenagers basically act without thinking. Now, let's add on to that the idea of social media and interaction through that, and let's look at some mental health issues associated with social media. Now, you have these adolescents that are relating and doing all these things. Their brains are still not, developing quite as far as they will when they get older. They're not completely developing. They're reacting emotionally, and they're interacting with the same types of people. And now mental health issues are showing to be, the result of that. Due to high utilization of social media, certain media-specific mental health issues have been identified. Facebook depression, believe it or not, that's a thing. It's a form of depression that begins with excessive use of social media, and it results in classic depressive symptoms. In other words, this is a mental health condition that is specifically the result of utilization of too much social media. Another mental health issue unique to social media is what's called Facebook envy. And that's a condition that happens when social media users compare themselves with other social media users. It leads to damage to self-esteem, self-image, and self-satisfaction, and that's a precursor to depression as well. Though both of these conditions are called Facebook depression and Facebook envy, they're not unique to Facebook. It's just a word that they use as a classic social media medium, but honestly, that applies to any form of social media, be it Instagram, be it Twitter, or any other types of things that I'm probably not aware of. Another interesting aspect of social media usage among adolescents is the concept of cyberbullying. Now, cyberbullying is different from traditional bullying and is defined as the use of electronic communications for the purpose of inflicting willful and repeated harm to others. Now, this can be done through email, through computers, through cell phones, or any devices connected to the internet that allow you to communicate with other people. What makes this so different from traditional bullying is that cyberbullying, the perpetrator and the victim don't have to be face-to-face. As a matter of fact, they're not face-to-face, and it means it can be anonymous. What that means is not being face-to-face and possibly being anonymous, the number and severity of cyberbullying incidents increase. The effects of cyberbullying on victims can include things like anxiety, low self-esteem, fear, stress, and rage. Other things that will happen oftentimes with victims of cyberbullying is attendance in school drops off, school grades drop off, and school itself is seen as a place of not only an unsafe place, but it's also seen as a possible volatile place. School mistrust happens as a result of cyberbullying. Another interesting thing about cyberbullying, though, is that cyberbullies actually rarely acknowledge that their acts are wrong. This is what's known as moral disengagement, and it's a form of justification. And this occurs when an act is performed that runs contrary to the personal moral framework of that person. And what that does is that allows them to avoid feelings of guilt and shame. And this, why moral disengagement happens or how it happens, or the best framework in which this happens, is that there is a perception of a greater distance between the bully and the victim when it's an online encounter, and the relationship is dehumanizing because it's more of an anonymous act and you're not face to face. Those two things allow people, particularly in this case cyberbullies, to act in ways they normally wouldn't. They have those filters and they have those protections. And then, moral disengagement allows them to act those ways even further. Let's talk a little bit about adolescence, media, and violence. Use of media by adolescents between the ages of 18 has risen dramatically over the years. A 2010 study has shown that adolescents spend an average of 7 hours a day using different media sources. Each week, adolescents average more than 30 hours of DVD and television viewing, 17 hours of listening to music, and 10 hours on the computer. In addition to that, over 8 hours are spent playing video games. Now, what's really interesting about the video game aspect is that another study done about the same time shows that 99% of teen boys and 94% of girls all play video games. Of those video games, a study showed that 90% of games that were rated appropriate for children contained some level of violence. Put that all together, it means that in 2008 to 2010, the vast number of teens playing video games were playing games which contained violence. Speaking of violence, experimental studies show that even a brief exposure to media violence can cause desensitization to real-world violence. Meaning that if you're playing a violent video game or watching something violent, you see something violent in real life, it's not going to affect you as real or deeply because you've experienced that already, albeit through media. Cognitive and emotional empathy, which are cognitive and emotional empathy is the ability to think and feel for a situation. Another study showed that cognitive and emotional empathy increased in adolescents who were exposed to low to medium levels of violence. In other words, when they were exposed to small to moderate amounts of violence, their ability to think and feel for that situation and be affected by that situation increased. Conversely, that cognitive and emotional empathy declined as those adolescents were exposed to higher levels of violence. In other words, the more violence these adolescents are exposed to, the less they're able to think and feel and be affected by those situations of violence. Some people argue that playing violent video games or watching violent movies doesn't make them more aggressive in nature. Now, aggression is, just for purpose of definition, aggression is behavior intended to harm another person. Again, these people, the basis of their argument that violent video games and watching violent movies don't make them more aggressive is that the sheer numbers of people that watch these movies and play video games, they're not more aggressive, they're just normal people. However, that argument really works against them. Point of fact, studies have shown that people who play violent video games and watch violent movies have a distorted perception of aggression. It's not unlike trying to look at a scene through a foggy window. You cannot make out the specifics of what's beyond that. And what I mean by that in relation to this is that these people who play large amounts of violent video games and watch violent movies lose the ability to differentiate aggression from normal behavior. In a sense, certain levels of aggression are normal behavior to these people. Not saying that they're violent people, but witnessing aggression is seen as a normal behavior. It's acceptable. So really, they can't argue against that aggression statement because they can't even recognize aggression at this point. Now, in relation to movies and video games, a huge aspect of games and movies and the storylines of these things is the concept of revenge. It's huge in our culture and in our media. Many popular movies have revenge as their plot line, just as many video games do as well. I'm sure any of you that either watch movies or play video games realize this. Basically, the main character goes about righting wrongs, seeking justice due to the wrongs that have been done to either the main character or those that they love. The subtle danger is that in many cases, violence is the acceptable way for that main character to exact revenge or seek justice. What's really scary is that in seeking revenge, violence actually becomes violence as a tool to seek revenge is now not only acceptable, but it's morally correct and it's expected. So somebody seeking revenge is going to utilize violence and it's going to be celebrated in media today. Speaking of revenge, did you know that most schoolyard acts of aggression are retaliatory in nature? What that means is that acts of violence that happen in the schoolyard by far are perpetrated by those who feel they've been wronged and are seeking justice through violence. The U.S. Secret Service, after developing a profile for both school shootings and school shooters, have determined the most common motivation for those acts, those school shootings by those school shooters, over 75% in fact, was revenge by shooters holding a grudge, either real or imagined, against the victim or victims. Again, revenge is the motivation. Revenge is the tool by which people seek justice, and violence is not only acceptable, but it is expected and it is celebrated. Now, on a personal note, I don't know how many of you know this, but I'm an emergency services dispatcher, and last night, ironically enough, I had to take a call from some alarmed students and teachers and parents who had received images through social media from a 15-year-old girl, and she had posted pictures of herself holding several different hunting rifles, saying something to the effect of that there were going to be a lot of sorry people at school the next day for the way she was treated. Obviously, action had to be taken. We had to send out the police to speak with her and conduct an investigation and find out what happened. But I guess sadly is probably the best way to put it. When confronted, she saw her actions as completely acceptable and didn't understand what the big deal was. That means one of two things. Either she thought it was perfectly fine to do those things and didn't see why it mattered, or that, in fact, threatening harm through firearms on a school grounds was an acceptable and expected behavior. That's a real-world application to everything we've been talking about so far. You know, from everything from the development of adolescents, cognitively speaking, and their inability to differentiate their emotions and simply react that way, to the interactions on social media where they are role modeling with like-minded peers, developing the same ways, developing their own culture, to this exposure to media and violence, to cyberbullying being prevalent today more so than ever before because of our media access, to violence in video games and movies, to the idea of revenge being acceptable. It all comes together, and it really does point to a culture that celebrates media in so many ways, that is so disconnected from each other on, well, proper emotional levels and mature levels, and really a culture that celebrates violence. I'll close this up with some biblical perspective on violence and revenge. Proverbs 3:31 states, "Do not envy the violent or choose any of their ways." Our culture sadly has done just that, with all the violence being celebrated in media today. On the topic of revenge, our culture seems to love that too. The Bible says in 1 Peter 3:9, "Do not repay evil for evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing." Well, that's all I have to say about that. Thank you very much. Have a great night.